Hey guys, Vern here. Today I'm going to walk you through how to build a PC and what it takes to make it happen. Now there are a lot of videos out there in regards to building a PC, but what we're going to do today is we're going to go step by step until we complete the build. Now we can always do a time lapse in regards to the build, but today I'd like to show you a more in-depth way to put a PC together from start to finish. Generally the most important tool that you'll need in regards to building a PC is a screwdriver. And it helps to have different heads or multiple screwdrivers to make sure that you can fit in all the screws. Another thing you're going to need for more so for cable management is either twisty ties or Velcro straps or, well, electric tape. Now another thing you're going to need is CPU compound. It's going to be the material that's going to be used between the CPU and the heatsink to make sure they make proper contact. Now there are retail heatsinks out there that already have pre-applied compound on them, so in that case you don't have to use any additional compound. But in this case I do have a heatsink that has pre-applied, but I did purchase a different one, a better one, so I'm going to remove the existing and I'm going to replace it with this. Now just in case you're wondering what kind of compound it is, today I'll be using Arctic Silver Ceramic 2. Now I also have alcohol swabs here to clean off any additional compound. Now I also have a flashlight here just in case we encounter any dark areas that neither one of us can see. Now there are other tools out there that are commonly used in regards to building PCs. For example, anti-static wraps as well as anti-static mats. So the biggest enemy of PC building is actually static. So whenever you do build a PC, just please make sure that you're not building it on carpeting because that would cause static, and make sure to ground yourself before you start your build. Alright, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to start off with the motherboard actually, and that's going to be where all the components are going to be placed on, and want to make sure that it's prepped before we place it into the computer case. So let's start off with the motherboard right here. Now you'll notice there is a camera here to make sure you guys have a great view in regards to the building process. And let's get started here. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to actually prep it in regards, well, for use with the heatsink that I have. So what we're going to do first is we're going to put in the, well, in this case, this guy right here, the mount for the heatsink, to make sure that that is ready. Okay, so we're going to put that here. Make sure that these guys over here are aligned with the motherboard in the back. There are holes right there, you'll notice. There are holes right there in the four corners. And you want to make sure that your mount does align with those holes. There we go. Alright, so you'll notice here that the mounts are in place. So you just got to make sure you place the screw head, the associated screw head. So I'll place that one at a time. Alright, so we're done with step one. Now the next step is actually placing the processor. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the latch here. There we go. It's going to go up here. There we go. There's the socket. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to take the processor we have here, and we want to make sure that it lines up to where it needs to be on the motherboard, so, or in that socket. Now the good part is on the processor itself, there's going to be 3 points to make sure you match up with the motherboard. There's going to be 2 nooks right there, and right there, and an arrow pointing in a certain direction to make sure that it lines up with the motherboard. Now notice on the motherboard there's going to be those 2 that the processor would fit in, and there's the section here where the arrow would be. So just want to make sure everything fits in properly before you latch the processor down. Now as you're placing the processor into the motherboard, you want to make sure not to make contact with the actual heat spreader or the metal portion on top of the processor, because you don't want any kind of impurities to prevent any good contact between the, well, in this case, the processor, as well as the heatsink or the cooler you'll be using. So what you want to do is you want to touch it on the sides, right there. Or the top. You can also do it from the top. Let's do it from the top in this case. And just want to be careful. You line everything up. There we go. Now before you clamp it down, there is a cap that you may want to remove. You don't actually have to remove it because as you clamp it down, it actually pops off, but I prefer to remove it. But yeah, just feel free to remove it to make sure everything's okay with that. But you'll notice also, as you clamp it down, there is going to be some form of resistance, but don't worry, that is completely normal. Just make sure everything lines up. Now, you'll notice here, the clamp does have to go under this circular right here. Just make sure it goes under there before you clamp it down, and you should be good. So there we go. Now we're in there, and we're gonna officially clamp it down. Now you'll notice I am experiencing quite a bit of resistance here, but that's okay. Completely normal. There we go. And we're officially in. Now the next part is we're gonna put on the memory. This type of system requires DDR4. Different systems require different type of memory. In this case, it requires DDR4. On the memory itself, there's going to be a NUC right there that fits into the motherboard. Just make sure that everything lines up before you press down into the motherboard to make sure everything's good. Now, on the motherboard itself, there we go. You'll notice that there's the memory slots right there. And yes, there is that same NUC right there to match up. So make sure that everything matches up in lieu of the memory stick before you start pressing down. There we go. Now when it comes to the memory, the first thing you actually need to do is to make sure that the memory slot is open. So make sure that these guys right here, you notice I just opened this one right here and this one's still closed. So press down and that's going to open it up. And the other side there isn't any, that's automatic. So just make sure that those aren't latched. There are going to be different type of motherboards. Both sides generally do have it closed, at which point you need to open it. In this case, I just have to do these guys in the bottom. So just want to make sure you line up that memory stick right there. It does line up properly, which is great. And we just press down until you hear it lock in. So what I generally do is this type of method right here. So, or there we go, that works too. Use the finger method. All right, so do the same thing for the other side. Make sure the teeth or the NUC lines up okay. And do the same thing we did before. Press down until you hear it lock. There we go. Okay, once you hear it lock, everything should be aligned properly. You'll notice everything is aligned properly, so we should be good in that regard. So in this case, the processor and the memory are set. Now notice I am using a type of pad under the motherboard to make sure as I press into it and apply force that doesn't damage the motherboard. Now the next step is actually to prep the case. And well, what I usually do is put in the back plate first. So make sure we do that right now. Okay, now let's place in that back plate. The back plate is generally in the back, hence the back plate. So you'll see it here, right there. So just make sure we line that up properly. Well, there's the back plate, and actually it comes in from the inside. So there we go, make sure it lines up, and press out to make sure that it latches on. And just make sure that you do it for all four corners to make sure that it's ready to go. Now you notice the back plate is all set here in regards to, just make sure that it does line up properly with the motherboard, the way it's set up, to make sure that everything does work. So now that we got the back plate in there, the next step is actually to get the motherboard in the case. So just want to make sure to move the cables, the case cables out of the way. And there we go. Make sure they're out of the way. Now just before you put in the motherboard, just make sure you have these guys. These guys are the mounting screws that you're going to be using to actually, well, connect the motherboard to your case. Just make sure you have that readily available so that once you do place in the motherboard, you're good to go in regards to mounting it with those screws. Alright, so the case is ready to go. Motherboard is ready to go. Now the good thing about the motherboard, the ITX type of motherboard format, it only comes with 4 screws right there, 4 mounting screws. So just want to make sure you align that right there with the case, and we should be good. Just make sure you also use 2 hands for this, because you don't want to damage the case or the motherboard, especially not the motherboard. So just 2 hands. There we go. Move those, I guess to mention, make sure those cables are out of the way. And we're gonna start aligning those screw holes. All right, now this is gonna be the first set of screws we're gonna put in. You'll notice that the screwdriver I have here is actually magnetic. Now the reason for that is it makes it so much easier to place in the screws if you have a magnetic screwdriver. So that's the reason I'm using it. So just make sure that you're ready to go here. All right, so that's it for the screws. The motherboard is now mounted to the case, which is great. So we can move on to the next part, which let's see here. Let's prep up the hard drives. So this case comes with a plate that you can actually remove that we removed earlier to fit in the motherboard, but let's get right here. You notice that the plate slides in right in there, but you want to make sure that the hard drives are set. Now there are actually 3 slots for hard drives in this case, and I'm actually going to be using all 3. As there's also, get that flashlight over here. Now you'll notice there's also a slot right there on the bottom part of the case, which I'll also be using. So that's actually going to be the first one we're going to mount right now. Now the good part about this case, it does come with all 12 screws here for all of your SSDs. So just make sure you find all 12, as there are no extra ones, and just make sure you line up the SSDs. So there's SSD right here, right there, and we're gonna align it into the case. Once you have everything lined up with the hard drive and the case, just put in the screws one step at a time. Alright, so that's one SSD. Alright, so we're gonna do the other 2. The other 2 are actually gonna be well mounted on this bracket here. Just make sure we line it up. The way it's set up here on the bracket is that it only goes in one way. Make sure you line up the connectors where there's a gap right there, connectors, gap. That's actually placed in from the bottom. So, just line up those screws into these screw holes right there. Just like that. And then we can start putting in the screws. Alright, so you'll notice there are all 8 screws right there. Make sure they're all tight. And I have 2 SSDs on the plate to make sure that's ready to go. Now, one of the reasons I actually installed the SSD in the bottom first is that the heatsink I'll be using is rather large. And it's actually going to be taking up the spot of the front of the case. And it's going to be a combination more so liquid cooler radiator as well as the case / CPU fan. There's only going to be one fan in this case. So it's going to be a universal one as a CPU as well as a case fan all in one. What I'm going to do actually for this configuration is I'm going to put in the cooler right here. Here, let me get you a better view. Here's the front of the case. Here's SSD. Here's the front of the case where the radiator is going to be. Also comes with actually the air filter, which is really nice. Keep the dust out. And here is the actual radiator slash cooler that we're going to be using. Here's the heatsink right there. Here's the radiator and the tube in between. It's going to be a closed loop liquid cooler we're going to be using. And that's going to mount in front of the case. And yeah, you'll notice in the front of the case there's not much space. And there's a pretty big radiator right there. Now you'll notice also there is compound and on the heatsink, a pre-applied compound. We're not going to be using that. So we're going to need to remove that by using those wipes I was talking about earlier. Now we're going to clean out that compound with that wipe, but you'll notice that I covered up my finger. That's going to clean it off. Now the reason for that is that generally compounds are hard to take off and they could be irritants. So you don't want that in your finger, your hand, or anywhere on or near you. So that's the reason why, well, I covered up my finger here to clean it off. And let's start cleaning off that spreader. All right. Now you'll notice though it's very clean. You just want to make sure it dries off before you apply your your preferred compound. All right, so now that we've cleaned off that compound, we should be able to mount it without issue. So let's do that next. Now before we can mount the heatsink though, what we need to do is we need to remove the front of the case. And to do that, what we need to do is we need to unscrew the front of the case. All right, and then after we remove the screws, there are two latches here on top that we need to push from the inside. We need to actually push them up to remove the front. So there we go. And it should pop right off. All right, so now that we got that off, let me get that radiator ready here. Now there are two ways to go about putting the radiator on. As you'll notice that the tubes are only on one side. The most common way that I've seen that I'll be doing today is we're going to have the tube section on the outer part to make sure that's aligned, and also to make sure there's enough space for other components. Just be careful as you put in the radiator. Don't want to damage it. All right, so the radiator goes slowly in there. Now you notice on the heatsink itself, on the radiator, there are actually 4 screw holes right there. Just make sure they line up with the case before you start screwing it in. Now because of the tubes though that are getting in the way, what I'm also going to need to do is remove the power supply bracket right there by unscrewing these guys right here. Alright, so I'm going to do that right now. Get that bracket off. Alright, now we should have leeway to get everything connected. Alright, there we go. Alright, so now that the radiator is mounted, what we're going to do is we're going to place in the Noctua NF-F12 fan that we'll be using for the radiator. And we're going to do more so a pull type of configuration, where in this case the air is going to be going in that direction, in the direction into the case rather than out. And that should clear up any kind of, well in this case it's going to clear up any kind of dust problems that may cause. So all thanks to that air filter along with the configuration we're going to do right now, we should be good. On the radiator, what we're actually going to be doing next is we're actually going to be placing that heatsink right on the CPU. So we're going to need to prep that by getting the this guy right here, the heatsink compound ready. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to apply about the size of a grain of rice vertically on the CPU. Use my other hand so you can see it better. Alright, so the next part is we're actually going to start mounting. Here's the thing about this this heatsink, the tubes are rather rigid. Now the good thing about the hose though, or the tubes, is that they do have a protective sleeve on them. So you don't have to worry too much about puncturing them. But still gotta make sure you're careful. Alright, so what we want is we want these 4 sections right here, 4 screw holes to match up, to make sure that we're aligned. As soon as we're aligned, we can start putting the caps into the screws, or mounting screws on the other end, and we should be good. Now the good thing about these mounting screws, or the caps, is that they do have a screwdriver end right there, just in case you need to use that, which I will be, to make sure everything is connected tightly. Because you want to make sure there is enough pressure applied so that there's good contact between the heatsink, there we go, and the CPU. So we're going to do all 4 sides. Alright, so now what we need to do is we need to make sure there is power running to the radiator and the heatsink. So right there, and we're actually going to be connecting that to that CPU header that we were talking about earlier, in the corner right there. Let me light it up for you. The heatsink itself actually does come with 2, right there, 2 4-pin connectors. So we're going to be connecting the fan into that. It doesn't matter which one. Alright, so now that the headers are set, the next thing we're going to do is that power supply. So now for this setup, what I did was I got a smaller power supply to make sure it fits into the smaller case. But it doesn't actually work unless you get one of these. Now what this adapter actually does is that it converts a regular size power supply into, well, in this case, a smaller type, SFX version. So make sure you get one of these to make sure everything fits. Okay, now in this setup, because it is the smaller power supply, I won't actually be needing that bracket that we had earlier. The bracket that I removed to allow the heatsink to fit in, I don't have to put back. This is actually meant to hold up a bigger power supply. So we don't have to put that in, which is good. One less thing to worry about. Now we have almost everything in the case. The next part is actually going to be the connection of the video card. So let's do that. Now we're going to put in the video card right here. Now you'll notice this video card does come with a 6-pin, so we'll be using that later to connect with power. And it does use PCI Express right here. PCI Express slot right there. So you want to make sure that you line it up properly on the motherboard. There's the PCI slot right there. You want to make sure you line it up correctly. It does only go in one way, but it's always good to be sure. So let's go do that now. Let's put that in. Now you just got to make sure you're careful because this specific video card does not come with a back plate. So want to make sure you don't damage it by making contact with anything. Alright, so it's in the slot. What we're going to do is we're going to push down like we did the memory on each side and wait until it locks in. Now we got the radiator, we got the power supply, we got the video card, you got the memory and CPU. We're almost done. Alright, so everything's in there, motherboard's in there with the case, so we should be all set. The only thing left, aside from this guy right here, I want to make sure you get the storage back. But before we put that in, that's the last piece. What we need to actually do is we need to start connecting the power. So there are a bunch of power cords that we need to connect to make sure that everything is running smoothly, everything powers up. So want to make sure we get that set. Alright, now there is one thing I need to mention in regards to the power supply and the power cords. Now you'll notice there is only one cord for SATA cable, for SATA power. So remember that Steam SSD that we have in the bottom of the case? We're gonna need to use a different power source. So good thing is, rather than having to purchase another one of these guys, another one of the SATAs, it does come with a Molex right here, the Molex adapter. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna convert that Molex into a SATA. I have one of these guys right here. So I'm gonna convert it from here, connect that right there, and then it's gonna be a SATA for use with that SSD in the bottom. So, all right, so I'm gonna start putting that together right now. And the good thing about the power supply, with the flashlight here, they're also labeled. So you just wanna make sure you match out the cable. Yeah, match up the cable with the connector. It's actually a modular type of power supply. That way you can minimize the amount of cables that you need to use, which is great. Now you'll notice that the connectors right there are in a very, very tight spot. So just make sure you take your time to connect that. Well, that took longer than expected. When it comes to the power cabling, it's really tight. So it took me a little bit here to put all the cables in place. But what we're going to do is we're also going to be doing the SATA cables as well. Aside from the power, we got to make sure we got the data going through. So we got the SATA cables right here. I did connect one of them already, in this case to the 750 gig. Now we got to put in this back plate with the other two hard drives. This guy right here. And connect those connectors right there. All right, so we got that in. All right, everything's connected. Now we just have to do, even though it's really tight, some form of cable management. It's always good to have a little, pretty good cable management to make sure there's good air circulation in their case, to make sure that, make sure to keep the temperatures down. So. Now there is one thing I neglected to do, and that is the power, USB, and the audio. All right, so I had to take off the SSD backplate again, and that way I can make enough space so that I can connect the USB 3 connector as well as the audio connector. But now that they're both connected, I did reconnect the SSD plate here, and everything is actually ready to go. The cabling in its entirety, it's really tight. Well, I did tighten up even more through cable management what I could. Otherwise, the build should actually be ready to go. Thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. There will be additional videos in regards to this build down the road. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.